The Vandal was an old. It was a great old dragger. It was built in 1929 in, I am told, Damascotta, Maine, and it went to Boston. And the story that I have been told is that the Boston guys showed up. I think it was a couple of Italian guys, came up from Boston to get it, and the boat was all ready to go. And they climbed up in the wheelhouse, and I guess they were getting ready to fire up. And they said, "Where's the compass?" to the boat builder. And the boat builder said, "Well, you didn't say anything about a compass, so we didn't put one on here." And the guy said, "Well, how are we supposed to get to Boston?" He said, "When you get to the end of the Damascotta, turn right." So that's the story. I can tell you that it was a whaleback boat. It had a lot of bunks in it. It had gone by the time I got on it, it had been scalloping in some point in the 50s or so, and so it had I think 14 berths and all aboard of it. Now we fished it with 3 or 4 guys on it, but it had 14 bunks. It had a when I got on it, had a Fairbanks Morse 31A 8.5 engine. That's a 5-cylinder engine. The inline 5-cylinder inline engine with the air start valve, which I've talked about. We had an I-beam that went overhead down the engine room. The cylinder heads were individual, so you could take one out, and they were so big and so heavy that you would have to bring the chain fall down, and then you could actually pick the head off the boat once you get the the injector and air start valve out of it. You could actually lift the head off of the engine. The engine was probably I don't know that it was 20 feet long, but it was certainly close to 20 feet long, and in there were these inspection ports alongside of the crankcase, and I was a pretty skinny kid, and I could almost get in the engine, and when we changed the oil, we would wipe the inside of it down. I would wipe the inside of the engine down. You could throw a drop light in there and wipe the inside of the engine down. The flywheel on the thing was probably better than 4 feet in diameter. It had a bunch of holes in it where you could stick a crowbar or something like that if, for example, you had an air start valve stick and you were top dead center on the next one that was going to fire, so that, in other words, you had no way of getting the thing to turn over. You could take a bar and bar the flywheel over a little bit and get to another air start valve, or move a piston enough so that it was no longer top dead center, and maybe get it going that way. Interestingly enough, this great big engine was only rated for about, I don't know, I'm going to say 200 or 300 horsepower, but obviously it had lots of torque, had considerable cubic inch volume, and its top speed was 625 RPMs according to the manual. We steamed at 525 and towed at 500, and it idled at 300. So it was a great big slow-turning engine, and it burnt about 300 gallons, about 20 gallons an hour. So that, compared to today's engines in a boat that size, you'd probably burn 3 or 4 times as much fuel. We had a lister for a generator, which was a 2-cylinder crank start. You had the compression relief valves on the top. You'd crank away with the compression shut off, and then when it got you got it cranking pretty good, you'd close those valves, and the pistons would start compressing, and the engine would light off, and away you'd go, and you'd have electricity. We had a pretty big fish hole. It was, it was certainly the first fish hole I'd been on a boat where you could stand up, and 2 of me could have stood up in it. That was an eastern rig, so we had the house aft. The captain slept aft, and then we had the so-called turtleback aft to his stateroom, where we threw junk. There was a toilet in there, and we threw junk in there as well. And forward, there was a whaleback where we kept twine and stuff like that, typical of eastern rigs. And then the crew accommodations were down forward. And I think we had 12 bunks down forward. We had the one in the engine room where I stayed, or just after what we call the after engine room. There was an oil furnace there as well to keep us warm and keep the engine room and wheelhouse warm. And then down forward, there was 12 bunks, typical stateroom, eastern rig forecastle with a pointed table, and then the bunks you climbed up on. And then the after part of the forecastle was where the oil stove was, which provided heat and cooked. And we had a heat for the forecastle and a surface on which to cook, an oven in which to bake. And then after that, there was cabinets and a sink. The water was pumped up. We didn't have any pressurized water system, but you could pump cold water out and then heat it up on the stove. We had a 32-volt electrical system, so that was, by the standards of the day, it was probably pretty modern. I think today everybody has 110 and AC. This was the 32 and DC.